Hi, my name is Taylor Shinley, and I'm a senior at Mentor High School. I spent the year comparing the effectiveness of verbal and visual prompting on verbal and nonverbal students with autism. So a little bit of a background as to why I chose this topic. My brother does have autism, so throughout my whole life I have been very passionate and wanting to learn about it, and I do plan on pursuing a career that specializes in autism. And then along with that, I do work at an autism school over the summer, so getting that experience to see both the visual aids helping verbal and nonverbal students, I really wanted to see what the significance of the visual aids were. So a little bit of a background about this topic. The biggest thing that I found was one of the biggest challenges for people with autism is their communication and comprehension skills. And as a result of this inability to communicate with people, they do have more aggressive behaviors as their inability to understand and communicate with others. In addition to this, CDC just updated in 2023, as of a couple weeks ago, that 1 in 39 children are diagnosed with autism. This is a very significant number, meaning that it is impacting a large population on this earth. And then the last thing that I found was 25 to 30% of children with autism are minimally verbal or fail to develop functional communication. So with all this being said, it did lead me to two research questions. My first question being, will visual prompting be more effective for both verbal and nonverbal students with autism in kindergarten through 8th grade? And then the second question I asked was, will verbal students with autism respond better to verbal prompting than nonverbal students with autism? In addition to the two research questions, I did have 4 hypotheses. My first hypothesis was that students with autism will respond more accurately and faster to the visual prompt in comparison to the verbal prompts. The next one I formed was, when given a verbal prompt, the verbal students will respond more accurately. The next one was that overall, verbal students will have a faster response time in comparison to the nonverbal students. And then the last one I had was that nonverbal students with autism will have a faster response time to the visual prompt in comparison to the verbal prompts. So what I did for this, to begin, was obviously forming a population. I used students with autism in kindergarten through 8th grade. There were 26 students total that I collected. 11 of them were nonverbal and 15 were verbal. In order to have these participants, I did send consent forms home with their parents and had them sign over the consent of their students. The materials that I used were visual aid cards and a visual aid board with 5 objects, which I'll show in the next slide. And then I did use a stopwatch to record the students' response times. My variables for this study was the independent variable being prompting type, that being verbal or visual, and then the dependent variable being the response time and the accuracy of the response. So the materials I used are shown right here. This was my visual aid board with the 5 objects. This is just a laminated sheet and the objects are just velcroed onto that sheet. And then the visual aid cards were for the visual prompts. So the procedure for the verbal prompt was I would use the phrase, hand me the elephant, for example, and then I would start the stopwatch and record how long it took the student to respond to the prompts. In addition to that, accuracy was recorded, this being correct, incorrect, or no response. No response was qualified as I had prompted the student 5 times and they still hadn't answered the prompt, or sometimes the students just would pass the board back to me saying that they were finished. And then the last thing for no response was if it was over 1 minute and 30 seconds, I counted as a no response. And then all trials did take place on the same day of the week and a uniform was worn. It's been found that people with autism like strict schedules, they like things to be uniform, so I didn't want to seem out of the ordinary for them. Similarly, the procedure for the visual prompt, phrase hand me the elephant, for example, was used. However, the visual aid card was shown to help them with that. And then stopwatch was used to record the time, and then accuracy was recorded, again, the correct, incorrect, and no response, and then all the trials were taken on the same day of the week. So the findings of this. First thing I looked at was type of response versus their response time. When looking at the verbal prompt, the students took an average of 13.3 seconds to respond, while given a visual prompt, they took around 7.9 seconds to respond. When looking at the type of prompt and the accuracy, the students had around a 73.3% accuracy to the verbal prompts while having an 88.2% accuracy to that visual prompts. The next thing that I looked at was type of student and compared the verbal and nonverbal students. So for this one, I looked at type of students and their response times. The verbal students took an average of 7.5 seconds to respond, while the nonverbals took around 16.2 seconds on average, so almost a 10-second difference between their response times. And then the last thing I looked at was type of students and their accuracy when given the verbal prompts. So when given the verbal prompts, the verbal students had a 95.2% accuracy, when the nonverbal students only had around a 44.5% accuracy. So you might be asking, what does all of this mean? So what I decided to do was look at confidence intervals to prove the significance between the two variables. So the first one was on hypothesis 1, that being the visual in comparison to the verbal prompts. In terms of response time, I could only show with 80% significance that the students had a faster response time to the visual prompt compared to the verbal prompts. I do think this is because my standard deviation was around a 16.5, so I think that did impact my ability to show a high correlation. However, in terms of the accuracy, I could show 99% significance that the students did have a higher accuracy to the visual prompt in comparison to the verbal prompts. So the next thing I looked at was my hypothesis 2, which was verbal prompts in comparison to accuracy. I could show with 99% confidence that the verbal students had a higher accuracy than the nonverbal students when given that verbal prompt. The next thing I was showing was hypothesis 3, which was student type and their response time. This was shown with a 99% confidence that the nonverbal students did take longer overall to respond to the prompts. And then the last thing I looked at was supporting hypothesis 4, and that was nonverbal's response time compared to the prompting type. So I could show with 90% confidence that the nonverbal students had a faster response time when given a visual prompt in comparison to the verbal prompts. So what my overall conclusions were for this, all 4 of my hypotheses were supported, and my overall conclusion was that students with autism do respond overall better when given visual stimuli and information compared to that verbal information. So some things that I would change if I could go back and redo my study is, one thing is different question being asked. While the visual board was beneficial because the kindergarten through 8th graders knew what all of the objects were, that last 1 or 2 prompts tended to be faster just because the students knew what was coming next. If the butterfly hadn't been asked yet and it was the last prompt, some of the students were able to pick up that that would be the next thing that I was asking. Another thing similarly is different data collection method. The students were able to see my data chart that I was writing down all my notes on. Some of the students were looking over and very intrigued on how long it was taking them to respond. So they were more focused on how they were doing rather than what I was asking them. So I would definitely change that. And another thing is the grade and age level breakup. I did kindergarten through 8th grade, however this did result in that high standard deviation of a 16.5. The younger students just took an overall longer time to respond, so I think I would have a more accurate response if I broke them up based off their age and their age and grade level. So future research that I think would be interesting would be to compare students in an intensive autism school to the students in a special education autism unit. In my study, I had students from both populations, and I could truly see the difference. In an intensive autism school, the difference between the verbal and visual prompts was very significant, while those special education autism unit students, the difference wasn't that high. So I think it would be interesting to ask the question, are visual aids more useful in one type of school compared to the other? And then also, do students in an intensive autism school have different or more severe needs than those in a regular special education autism unit? Thank you for your time.